This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
In 1601, Maria Finn wrote to her mother-in-law, signing herself, "Your very loving and obedient daughter," and she included a lock of her own hair in the seal of the letter. You'll be able to see here, her hair is red as well. She was attempting to show deference and reconcile with a woman whose son she had secretly married several years earlier when still a teenager. But within a couple of years of this letter, Maria, who was a young woman then firmly established as an adult and mistress of the grand estate, was harshly criticising her mother-in-law for speaking of too much malice and asserting that she and her husband would never be influenced by her power to revenge. So it didn't work. This change in parent-child relationships over transitionary life cycle stages such as marriage is a theme that I look at in my doctoral research, particularly focusing on points of tension and the constant renegotiation of this relationship. And I'll come back to this letter and explain it a bit more later. Research on the experience of the child in the early modern period continues to grow, and I hope to add to current debates by considering the experience of children once they were no longer defined as children. There's been little work done on the relationship between parents and children past childhood, so this life cycle approach to the topic is a new one. Linda Pollock's body of work on parent-child relationships is comprehensive, but rarely considers the relationship throughout the life cycle. And more recently, Elizabeth Foister and Joanne Bailey have explored this area by looking at parental involvement in marriage arrangement and the adult memory of parenting, but there is scope for further study. Overall in my thesis, I aim to offer an insight into the way parenting and the parent-child relationship changed through the life course, particularly focusing on how parents and children related to one another from the teenage years onwards. The main source base for my research is letters between parents and children in aristocratic and gentry families, like the one I just described. And researching this paper and trying to situate my work into the emotional objects theme is the first time I've considered my sources in the context of material culture. I found letters to be an interesting source because they are both textual and material sources, and perhaps are considered less in studies of material culture for this reason. However, they can certainly be read as emotional objects through which families negotiated times of tension using both words and material additions. James Daybell's recent book, The Material Letter in Early Modern England, considers the materiality of letters and how their material aspects added to the meaning and social structures. He argues that we need to examine and locate texts in the spaces they were experienced, and I'm attempting to locate the letters I look at in their emotional spaces and consider the states of mind that might have led people to write and to keep, even treasure them at particular moments in life. I hope to consider both aspects of letters, text and materiality, to highlight how we can find out about the emotional relationships in families and look at the letters as emotional objects which describe emotional situations. Considering how they were written and received is important when using them to look at how personal relationships changed over the life course. Particularly for families separated by long periods, as many elite families were, letters were crucially important objects in revealing and negotiating life-changing events and situations, as well as organising everyday life. The letters themselves can be objects which represent major life cycle transition points, and Ilinka Rublak argues that how objects were made and what they were made from may have a bearing on how they were perceived and gained significance. And with letters, it's important to remember the emotions people would have felt on writing and receiving them as the process of their construction, which has this implication for understanding. We also need to consider that some letters survive because of the emotional situation they represented. Sometimes the fact of a letter's survival means that it was emotionally significant to its recipient, so it was kept and preserved. In this paper, I'll argue that letters are emotional objects in which families who are separated express their emotions about situations and family crisis points. Our reading of these sources must take into account the emotional states of the sender and recipient to fully understand them. Both their content and materiality make them emotional objects. And I'll support my point with giving examples from some of the families I've studied in the late 16th and early 17th centuries at different points of tension and renegotiation in the parent-child relationship. So one of the crisis points I consider in my research is separation itself, which I'll look at first. The separation was a fact of family life for aristocratic and gentry families in this period for a variety of reasons. Husbands and fathers were often required to work away from home in the royal court or in diplomatic positions, usually leaving their wives at home to run the estates. Tara Hamling and Catherine Richardson's collection about everyday objects defines objects as possessions which people owned. And letters weren't owned as such, but they do fit the definition of everyday objects for these families who had to communicate through letters, both for economic reasons, but also to maintain their personal relationships. There are many examples of letters from this period showing couples who missed each other and expressed this through their correspondence. Robert Sidney, the first Earl of Leicester, was married to Barbara Gamage in 1584 until her death in 1621. That's her with 6 of their 10 children. He frequently worked away from home as an ambassador for Elizabeth I in the Netherlands and later at the court of James I in London. And Barbara kept all the letters that Robert sent to her when he was away, resulting in a surviving collection of 332 letters documenting their marriage, including all the problems they faced as a family. That she kept all of her husband's letters suggests that they were important to her, and he sent her many letters lamenting their separation. This one, where he wrote, "Sweet Barbara, there is no desire in me so dear as is the love I bear unto you and our children, and therefore I pray you think I will prefer the care of you and them before anything else. But this journey is absolutely laid upon me without my seeking, and so far now I am embarked into it, as I cannot pluck out my neck without both touch of my reputation and danger to lose all hope of reward for the services I've already done. But however, I trust in God you nor your children shall never have cause to complain of an unworthy husband or father, though perhaps not so thrifty as you would wish. I will ever love you most dearly and your children, for you and they are my chiefest joys and riches." Comments about lack of money come up a lot. And a letter from later on that year gives us an indication of her response to him, seemingly expressing similar thoughts, as he replied to her, "I take it very kindly that you esteem it so great a contentment to be still with me," and again reasserting that he cannot tie myself to mine own home always. So he laments that. Letters between parents can also show us the difficulties that mothers faced in looking after young children, effectively as single parents when their husbands were away. And a letter from the Thin family papers shows us how the illness of children could affect a parent, especially when they were dealing with it on their own. The Thin family, who I mentioned at the beginning, were an aristocratic family based at Longley in Wiltshire. And in 1602, Joan Thin wrote to her husband John when their younger children, including their 12-year-old daughter Dorothy, were suffering from smallpox. And she wrote, "How far it will be for disfiguring of them I cannot yet tell, but their faces are very full of sores. God of his goodness send them well. Doll takes it very heavily and mourns very much by reason of the soreness and store of them. Neither can I without mourning look upon her. If you can learn anything that is good for them, I pray you send it down." I think this letter is full of emotion as Joan implores her husband to help her deal with the situation, even though they were apart. I think her anxiety and anguish over her sick children is obvious here, and due to their separation, she had to express this by the medium of a letter. So to move on to look at adolescence, as children grew up and sought independence away from the family home, this led to renegotiation in the parent-child relationship. And adolescence was a stage which could be fraught with emotion as children took on responsibility and began to assert adult authority. For aristocratic and gentry children, it was a common experience to be sent away from the home to be educated. In 1604, Catherine Paston sent her 14-year-old son William to university in Cambridge to continue his education, which was quite a normal time for aristocratic boys to go to university. Her letters to him in the 3 years that he studied there provide us an illuminating case study in how parents and children negotiated their first separation and the child's development into a young adult. Most of her letters contained advice about various subjects, including health, religious devotion, and his education, and she frequently referred to local news and events, helping to link William to the familiar home environment that he was separated from. She referred to the way they conducted matters at home, for example in a letter warning him about possetty drinks. "I hope thou dost not eat of those possetty curdy drinks, which however so pleasing, I'm persuaded are most unwholesome. But if need be to have such things, you know how clear they were made at home for thee, so let them be still." And this quote implies her concern that away from home, she can influence his health by controlling his diet. And she was keen to show she was still in a unique position of knowledge of her son, despite his departure from the home. And her letters often mention sending gifts and tokens from home to William, And it's important to consider that William must have looked forward both to receiving a letter from his mother, but also the items attached to it, particularly if these went some way to alleviating homesickness. In one letter from 1625, she advised him to be every way moderate in thy recreations and careful and temperate in thy diet, which is something she said a lot. And then she also explained that along with the letter, she'd sent him a cake, a cheese, a few puddings and links, a turkey pie pasty, a pot of marmalade, which he'd requested. So this practice in cheering up family members by sending gifts along with letters was something that William began to do himself as he got older. In 1626, Catherine reported to him that his younger brother had been ill, and in her next letter she wrote, "Thy brother remember his lovingest love to thee, and is very glad of the fine knife thou didst send him, which he will wear on high days. I thank God he's now very well again." So it appears that William had sent his brother a gift after hearing that he'd been unwell. And whether alleviating homesickness or cheering up an ill relative, the gifts that arrived with letters carried as much feeling and intention as the letters themselves, and complemented the written sentiments. And in this case, the content of letters reveals information about material gift exchanges between families that would otherwise be unavailable to historians, especially when considering food parcels, which certainly don't survive for us to examine, particularly when you're sending them to a 15-year-old boy. The majority of letters from William's time at Cambridge that survive are written by Catherine, and only 2 written by William were preserved. Although it would be useful to have the missing letters from William, it's worth considering the implications behind the limited survival of his correspondence. Clearly, Catherine wasn't as diligent in her correspondence as her son, or possibly she didn't consider her son's news of school days worthy of preservation most of the time. Letter writing was part of an education process which allowed children to develop their adult identities and engage with an adult form of communication. But as it was a required part of their schedule, some of William's letters would probably have been fairly formulaic. However, when looking at the first letter that survives from William, it looks likely that it was the first he sent to her after leaving the family home to start his studies. The letter has no particularly remarkable details. He recounts his news and what he's been studying. However, I think it speaks volumes about their relationship and the importance of this transitional stage and the rite of passage for William and for Catherine that she chose to keep this particular letter. Again, the collection of everyday objects looks at the afterlife of objects and the processes by which they became precious or meaningful, and this seems evident here. The adolescent experience of William can be reconstructed from the letters sent to him, and an insight into his relationship with his mother can be gleaned from the simple fact that she chose to keep the letter from him, which represented an important stage in their relationship. Daybell argues that surviving letters are only part of a picture, which is usually true, but here the fact that only certain letters survive actually adds to the picture and can help us to understand the relationship by exploring reasons why the letter was chosen to be kept. Catherine and William Paston negotiated this transition point in their relationship fairly well. She continued to advise her son, but also acknowledged his new status as a young adult who was gaining life experiences of his own. However, other families experienced children asserting their authority in opposition to their parents, and emotional letters could play a part in these crisis situations where anxiety and anger are expressed through letters. So back to the Finns of Longley and the letter I showed at the beginning of the paper. Their family correspondence contains evidence of a major family crisis over the clandestine marriage of John and Joan's eldest son, Thomas. The Finns had been embroiled in a long-standing feud with another influential Wiltshire family, the Marvins, and in 1594 Thomas married Maria Marvin, who was the daughter of Lucy. And if you're thinking the story of 2 teenagers from feuding families marrying in secret sounds familiar, you'd be right. Considering the date and the high profile of these families, it's quite likely that Shakespeare was inspired to write Romeo and Juliet from them. Both Thomas and Maria were 16 years old at the time of their marriage, and although Maria's family knew about the match, her mother probably arranged the whole thing. It was kept secret from Thomas's parents for over a year. When they found out, they were understandably angry. Maria had brought no dowry to the marriage, and there were no official documents to arrange any sharing of property or inheritance between the couple. The Finns attempted to have the marriage annulled, but the young couple insisted that they had both consented to the marriage and it was valid. Therefore, it was valid in the eyes of the church also. Parental disapproval was not enough. So letters between Joan Finn, Thomas's mother, Maria, his new wife, and Lucy Marvin, his mother-in-law, as they negotiated this extremely fraught situation, are further examples of letters being used to convey strong emotions between parents and children who had acted in opposition to their parents. Maria's initial letters to Joan were very much an attempt at reconciliation, and the letter I showed at the beginning has been described as particularly noteworthy, as she included the lock of her hair as a gesture of humility and appeasement to her mother-in-law. And similarly to the pastoral letters I described before, here a material addition to a letter complemented and intensified its meaning. These gestures, however, were in vain, and Joan refused to reconcile either with Maria or her mother, and she wrote to Lucy, Audley, Marvin, blaming her for the situation, saying, "My son was not long mine, but wrongfully detained from me before he had either years or experience to judge what was fit in so weighty a cause. I must lay the fault on your ladyship and take it for a heavy cross in this world." And most of the letters to Lucy and Maria are this sort of tone. She doesn't forget it. And so Maria's tone in letters also changed over time, and her letters moved from attempts at reconciliation to anger and resentment at the treatment of her and her husband by his mother. And she wrote to Joan several years after the marriage, stating her opinion quite plainly that "you talk too much of malice and revenge. Your will to show malice may be as great as please you, but your power to revenge is a bugbear that one that knows his own strength no better than Mr. Finn doth will never be afraid of." So essentially, her and her husband are not afraid of her and her revenge. And by the time of this letter, Maria was in her mid-20s. She was the wife of an important landowner. Thomas had inherited his father's estates the previous year, and she was the mother of the heirs to Longleat. So during this time, her growth into adulthood and a life in which she had her own authority and responsibility seemed to have led her to stop seeking reconciliation and showing deference to her mother-in-law. And the letters between the two women can be read as objects which convey the negative emotions which remained between the two throughout Thomas and Maria's marriage. It's possible that the two women never met. They certainly didn't live in the same house, so these letters were the only vehicle they had to negotiate their troubled relationship. Mary Roth, who was mentioned in the previous paper, the daughter of Robert and Barbara Sidney, that's her with her mother there, bad quality picture. Mary Roth had married in 1604 with the full consent of all parties, but letters between her parents, Robert and Barbara Sidney, show the anxiety parents could have about their children's marriages, even when the process of the match had been much more straightforward. It's a matter of debate how happy Mary Roth was in her marriage to Sir Robert Roth, but it certainly seems they had some disagreements in the initial stages of their relationship. As within a few months of the marriage, Robert sent Barbara a letter in which he expressed anxiety about his daughter and her new husband, saying, "I find by him," Robert Roth, "that there was somewhat that doth discontent him, for the particulars I could not get out, only that he protests he cannot take any exceptions to his wife," which is Mary Roth, his daughter, "nor her carriage towards him. It were very soon for unkindnesses to begin, and therefore whatsoever the matters be, I pray you let all things be carried in the best manner till we also meet. For mine enemies will be very glad for such an occasion to make themselves merry at me." And this letter, showing his anxiety about both family reputation and the well-being of his daughter, shows a common parental concern shared by Joan Finn as well, namely the lack of control that they had over their children as they entered adulthood and began to make their own decisions. The last life cycle crisis point I want to briefly discuss is how the parent-child relationship changed through old age and death. The Sidney family letters again highlight some of these issues, and one of the most emotional letters in the collection concerns the death of Robert and Barbara's daughter Philippa in childbirth at the age of 26. He wrote to her, "Sweetheart, my heart is too full of grief to use many words, especially since your grief must be as much as mine. We've lost as worthy and loving a daughter as ever father and mother had. But God's will be done, and I beseech him that while I live, yourself and those few that be left unto us may be spared. I'm weary of this place, and much the more since this woeful accident." When families were separated at difficult times, letters were the only form of communication available to them to share and deal with their grief. So here letters take on a special significance as objects of comfort for family members experiencing the desolation of losing a loved one. They have the power to capture a particular moment in time and to preserve memories that might otherwise have been forgotten in an era before the widespread use of diaries. And this letter is one of the last in the collection of Robert Sidney's letters, as Barbara died the following year. Fewer letters survive from him after the death of his wife, as she was the main keeper and preserver of his correspondence. But one letter from the later years of his life show us how his relationship with his children became more reciprocal in his old age. Robert's son, also named Robert, who later inherited his father's titles and became the second Earl of Leicester, was also engaged in diplomatic work for the monarch. And in 1622, the young Robert was to be sent on a trip to the Netherlands, and Robert Sr. wrote to Ambassador Dudley Carleton to plead with him not to send his son out of the country. And he wrote that, "He is my only son, and since his mother's death, my chiefest comfort." So this letter shows us that, particularly after the death of his wife, Robert became more reliant on his children for support. And the dynamics in the relationship had shifted, and in some ways as adults he needed his children to take on a more dominant and responsible role for their parent. We can also see Robert Sidney as someone who had throughout his life relied on letters as a form of communication, where he had to conduct his relationships and deal with difficult situations when separated from those involved. In this way, his letters were objects in which he was required to convey emotions to the recipient. And Barbara's preservation of his letters throughout her lifetime show his success in making the letters objects with emotional resonance for her. So to briefly conclude, studying letters as emotional objects, both in their content and materiality, show us the changing emotions felt by parents and children as they negotiated their relationship through life cycle stages and challenges, including adolescence, marriage and old age. Reflecting on the emotions behind the writing, receiving and preservation of these letters helps us to understand the relationships behind them. In this way, considering both the textual and material aspect is beneficial, and letters can give us an insight into the everyday experience of these families, where life cycle crises were often exacerbated by separation, as letters were objects on which emotions were conveyed. I'll finish there, and I hope I've given an overview of some of the areas that I consider through the theme of emotional objects. As I've said, this is the first time I've considered my work in terms of material culture, something I'd like to look into further, so any comments or questions would be